The distant thunder of hoofbeats was the only warning Katherine Ambrose had before the stranger arrived, dust billowing behind him like the ghosts of her broken dreams. She stood on the creaking porch of her homestead, hands raw from scrubbing laundry, her 23 years feeling more like 50 in that moment. 3 years a widow in the unforgiving Montana territory of 1876, and the whispers of Coyote Creek had only grown crueler with time. Katherine brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face as the rider approached. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting sun. Something about him, perhaps the deliberate way he handled his mount or the watchful tilt of his head, told her this was no ordinary drifter. "Evening, madam," he called, tipping his hat as he reined his horse to a stop. His voice carried an unfamiliar accent, something Eastern perhaps, but tempered by years on the frontier. "State your business," Katherine replied, one hand discreetly reaching for the shotgun propped against the doorframe. Lone riders meant trouble more often than not. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Xavier Lawson, looking for work and a place to rest my horse." His eyes, the color of summer storm clouds, met hers directly. "Heard in town you might be hiring," Katherine nearly laughed. "Whoever told you that was having a jest at both our expenses, Mr. Lawson? This farm barely sustains me." He nodded slowly, his gaze traveling over the weathered fence, the small garden struggling against the summer heat, and the leaning barn with its missing shingles. "Seems to me you could use an extra pair of hands regardless. I cannot pay you. Room and board would suffice until harvest." She studied him more carefully now. His clothes were worn but clean, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes, there was something in them that spoke of education and purpose rather than the wild desperation she'd seen in too many men out here. "Why would a man like you work for nothing but meals and a roof?" Xavier Lawson removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with early silver at the temples. "Sometimes a man needs to stop running, Mrs. Ambrose, Katherine Ambrose," she hesitated. "My husband died 3 years ago." Understanding passed across his features. "I'm sorry for your loss." The sincerity in his voice weakened her resolve. Katherine had been alone too long, fighting every day against the land, the elements, and the prejudice of a town that saw a childless widow as worthless. The upcoming harvest would likely break her if she attempted it alone. "The barn has a small room. It leaks when it rains, but it's yours if you want it." She gestured toward the weathered structure. "We start at dawn." Xavier nodded, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I'll be ready, Mrs. Ambrose." "Katherine," she corrected, surprising herself with the informality. "If we're to work together, you might as well use my given name." "Katherine," he repeated, the name sounding different in his mouth, something precious and respected. She watched as he led his horse toward the barn, his tall figure straight despite what must have been a long journey. Katherine couldn't say why she trusted this stranger, only that something about him felt like the first cool breeze after a stifling summer day. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another human being settling into her property. It had been so long since she'd shared her space with anyone. The loneliness that had become her constant companion felt different somehow, less crushing with the knowledge that beyond her walls, another soul breathed under the same stars. Dawn arrived with the distant crow of a rooster from a neighboring farm. Katherine rose and dressed quickly, pinning her hair in a simple bun at the nape of her neck. When she stepped outside to draw water from the well, Xavier was already there, sleeves rolled up as he repaired a broken slat in the chicken coop. "Good morning," he said, straightening as she approached. "Hope you don't mind. Noticed this was falling apart yesterday." Katherine blinked in surprise. "Not at all, thank you." The morning progressed with a strange new rhythm as they worked side by side. Xavier moved with quiet efficiency, anticipating needs before she voiced them. By midday, he had repaired not only the chicken coop, but also reinforced the sagging front step, and cleared a clogged irrigation ditch that had been flooding her vegetable garden. Over a simple lunch of corn bread and beans, Katherine found herself studying her unexpected helper. "You've worked farms before. It wasn't a question, but Xavier answered anyway. Grew up on one back east, Pennsylvania, left when I was 18, to seek your fortune out west. There was no mockery in her tone, only curiosity. A shadow passed over his features. Something like that. He didn't elaborate, and Katherine didn't press. Everyone in these parts had stories they preferred not to tell. The days settled into a pattern. Xavier worked from sunrise to sunset, tackling repairs Katherine had put off for years, the barn door that wouldn't close properly, the leaking roof, the fence posts that had rotted through. Under his care, the small homestead began to transform, as if waking from a long slumber. At first, their conversations were brief, practical exchanges about the work at hand. But gradually, over evening meals or during water breaks in the shade of the old oak tree, words flowed more freely. "Why did you stay?" Xavier asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon. "After your husband passed." Most women would have returned east or remarried. Katherine's fingers tightened around her cup. This land was Thomas's dream. He died believing we could make something of it. She looked out at the fields, golden in the fading light, and I had nowhere else to go. My parents disowned me when I married him. They wanted me to wed the banker's son, secure a comfortable future. But you chose love instead, she smiled faintly. I chose Thomas. He promised me adventure and a family of our own. The smile faded. We had the adventure at least. Xavier was quiet for a long moment. No children, the question pierced her like a physical pain. No, we tried for years. The last doctor who passed through said there was something wrong with me. Her voice hardened. The town has their own theories about why I'm barren. Some say it's punishment for defying my parents. Others believe it's because I don't attend church regularly. People fear what they don't understand, Xavier said softly, and they're cruel when they're afraid. What would you know of it? The words came out sharper than she intended. He didn't seem offended. More than you might think. Before she could question him further, the distant rumble of thunder grew louder and fat raindrops began to fall. Storm's coming, Xavier observed, rising to his feet. I should secure the animals. Katherine watched him stride toward the barn, his figure briefly illuminated by a flash of lightning. There was a story there, behind those storm-gray eyes, but like her, Xavier Lawson guarded his past carefully. The summer heat gave way to the first hints of autumn. The days grew shorter, the mornings crisper. Katherine found herself looking forward to their quiet conversations, to the small ways Xavier's presence had begun to fill the empty spaces of her life. She caught herself watching him as he worked, admiring the strength in his hands, the quiet concentration on his face. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to notice a man that the feelings confused her. Xavier was her hired hand, nothing more. When harvest ended, he would likely move on, as all drifters eventually did. One morning in late September, Katherine headed into town for supplies. She'd been avoiding Coyote Creek as much as possible, preferring isolation to the judging eyes and whispered comments that followed her through the dusty streets. But with harvest approaching, she needed tools and seeds that couldn't wait. The mercantile was crowded when she entered, and conversation died as heads turned in her direction. Katherine lifted her chin and walked directly to the counter where old Mr. Hollister stood polishing his spectacles. "Morning, Mrs. Ambrose," he said, his tone neutral. At least Hollister treated her with basic courtesy, if only because her money spent as well as anyone else's. "I need these items," she said, sliding a list across the counter. As Hollister gathered her supplies, Katherine became aware of a conversation behind her. "Heard she's got a man staying out at that falling-down place of hers," a woman's voice said, deliberately loud enough to carry. "Probably warming her bed, too," another replied with a snicker. "Always knew she was no better than she ought to be." Katherine's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her gaze fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge the barbs. "Shameful is what it is," the first voice continued. "Barren as the Badlands and still trying to trap another husband, ladies." A new voice cut through the gossip, deep and commanding. Katherine turned to find Sheriff Mills standing in the doorway, his weathered face stern. "I believe your husbands are waiting for you at the church social committee." The women gathered their packages with matching expressions of righteous indignation and swept past Katherine without meeting her eyes. When they'd gone, Sheriff Mills approached the counter. "Mrs. Ambrose," he said with a nod, "been meaning to ride out to your place." Alarm flared in Katherine's chest. "Is there a problem, Sheriff? Just wondering about your visitor. Man calling himself Xavier Lawson. He's working for me through harvest," she replied cautiously. "Is there some difficulty?" Mills studied her for a moment. "Might be. Had a wire from Colorado Springs. They're looking for a man matching his description in connection with a shooting." Katherine felt the blood drain from her face. "There must be some mistake. Mr. Lawson has been nothing but respectful and hardworking. Most wanted men are until they aren't." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Just be careful, Katherine. You're out there alone with him. I'll be riding by to ask him some questions in the next day or so." She paid for her supplies with trembling hands, her mind racing. Xavier wanted for shooting someone. It seemed impossible. The gentle man who had rescued a fallen robin's nest and carefully returned it to its tree could not be a violent criminal, yet she knew so little about him. The careful way he avoided speaking of his past, the watchfulness in his eyes when riders approached the farm. By the time Katherine returned to the homestead, the sun was low in the sky. She found Xavier by the corral, training the young colt they'd purchased from a neighboring farm. He looked up as she approached, a smile warming his features before faltering at her expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately alert. Katherine set down her packages. "Sheriff Mills stopped me in town. He says there's a wire from Colorado Springs about a man matching your description, something about a shooting." Xavier's face went still, all emotion draining away. "I see. Is it true?" She searched his face, praying to see denial or confusion. He turned away, running a hand along the colt's neck. "Not the way they tell it." "Then tell me your way," Katherine demanded, moving to stand before him. "I have a right to know who I've welcomed onto my land." For a long moment, Xavier said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "I was a teacher in Colorado Springs, taught at a small school for minors' children. Of all the things Katherine had imagined, this wasn't among them." "A teacher," he nodded. "There was a girl, 14 years old, bright as they come. Her father was the foreman at the largest mine, a man with a temper and heavy fists." Xavier's jaw tightened. "One day she came to school with bruises she couldn't hide. When I questioned her, she broke down and told me what he'd been doing to her for years." Katherine's hand went to her throat. "My God." "I reported it to the sheriff. He was the mine owner's cousin." Bitterness crept into Xavier's voice. "Nothing happened except the girl stopped coming to school. When I went to check on her, her mother said she'd been sent to relatives back east." The look in that woman's eyes, he shook his head. "I knew the girl wasn't visiting relatives." "What did you do?" Katherine whispered, confronted her father at the saloon. "Told him I knew what he'd done and that I wouldn't stop until justice was served." Xavier's eyes met hers, unflinching. "He pulled a knife. We struggled. My gun went off. You killed him. He lived. But in a town where the mine owns everything and everyone, shooting the foreman even in self-defense is a death sentence. I ran." Katherine absorbed his words, trying to reconcile this story with the man she'd come to know. "The sheriff will be here tomorrow. What will you do?" Xavier looked out over the land they'd worked together, his expression unreadable. "That depends on what you want me to do." "What I want," she echoed. "If you believe I'm dangerous, I'll be gone before sunrise. You can tell the sheriff honestly that you sent me away." The thought of him leaving sent a sharp pain through Katherine's chest. "And if I don't," something flickered in his eyes, hope, perhaps, "then I stay and face whatever comes." Katherine thought of the gossip in town, the cruel words about her taking in a man, the assumptions about her character. Sending Xavier away would be the respectable choice, the safe choice. But when she looked at him, she saw not a dangerous fugitive but a man who had stood up for a child when no one else would. "We have a harvest to bring in," she said finally. "I expect you to fulfill your commitment." Relief washed over his features. "Katherine, but no more secrets," she interrupted. "If we're to face this together, I need to know everything." Xavier nodded slowly. "No more secrets." That night, as they sat by the fire, Xavier told her the full story about growing up the son of a strict Presbyterian minister. about losing his mother young and finding solace in books, about working his way through college and discovering his calling as a teacher. He spoke of the children he'd taught in mining towns across the West, of the corruption and poverty he'd witnessed, and of his growing disillusionment with a justice system that protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. In return, Katherine shared her own story, her sheltered upbringing in Boston, meeting Thomas at a social when she was just 18, their scandalous elopement, and the difficult journey west. She told him about the miscarriages, the growing desperation as each year passed without a child, and finally, the loneliness that had nearly consumed her after Thomas's death. "The town calls me worthless," she admitted, staring into the flames. "A woman who cannot bear children has no value here." Xavier's hand covered hers, warm and calloused. "They're wrong. So wrong I hardly know where to begin telling you how wrong they are." Katherine looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice. "You rebuilt this farm with your bare hands after losing everything," he continued. "You face each day with courage when most would have given up. That's not worthlessness, Katherine. That's the most profound strength I've ever witnessed." Something broke open inside her at his words, a dam holding back years of pain and doubt. Before she could stop them, tears filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. Xavier moved to kneel before her chair, still holding her hand. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you." "No one has ever," she struggled to find words. "Everyone sees what I lack, no one sees what remains." "I see you," he said simply, and then, so quietly she almost missed it. "I've seen nothing else since the day I arrived." The air between them changed, charged with something new and fragile. Katherine found herself unable to look away from his face, from the vulnerability and longing written there, emotions that surely mirrored her own. When Xavier slowly raised his hand to brush away a tear from her cheek, she didn't pull away. His touch was gentle, reverent, as if she were something precious. "I should go," he whispered, though he made no move to stand. "Stay," Katherine replied, the single word holding all the permission he needed. When his lips met hers, it was like coming home to a place she'd never been, unfamiliar yet perfectly right. His kiss was tentative at first, then deepening as she responded, her hands coming up to frame his face. Later, Katherine would remember that night as the moment her life divided into before and after before Xavier, when she had existed but not truly lived, and after, when every sensation seemed heightened, every emotion more vivid and real. Sheriff Mills arrived the following afternoon when they were working together in the West Field. Katherine saw the dust from his horse long before he reached them, and anxiety coiled in her stomach. "Let me do the talking," she said quietly to Xavier as they watched the sheriff approach. Xavier shook his head. "I won't hide behind you, Katherine." The sheriff reined in his horse a few yards away, his expression neutral as he surveyed the pair of them. "Afternoon, Mrs. Ambrose, Mr. Lawson." "Sheriff," Katherine acknowledged. "What brings you out this way?" Mills dismounted, removing his hat. "Think you know why I'm here? Need to have a word with your hired man." Xavier stepped forward, shoulders straight. "Whatever you need to ask, Sheriff, I'm listening." "Were you in Colorado Springs earlier this year, teaching at the mining school?" "I was." Mills nodded as if confirming something. "And did you shoot Jacob Thornton, the mine foreman, on the night of April 17th? "I did," Xavier replied steadily. "In self-defense after he attacked me with a knife." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "That's not how Thornton tells it." "Claims you came at him unprovoked, ranting about his daughter." "Sheriff," Katherine interrupted, unable to stay silent, "Mr. Lawson has told me everything. He was defending himself after confronting Thornton about abusing his daughter." "Madam, with all due respect, this isn't your concern." "It is when you come onto my property accusing a man without hearing his side," she retorted. "Have you spoken with the daughter, asked her about the bruises?" A flicker of discomfort crossed Mills's face. "Girl's been sent back east, unavailable for questioning." "Convenient," Xavier remarked dryly. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Look, Lawson, I've got no personal stake in this, but Colorado Springs wants you brought in and I've got a job to do." "Are you arresting me?" Mills hesitated. "Not today, I'm waiting on more information." "But I'd advise against trying to leave the territory." Xavier nodded. "I have no intention of running, Sheriff. I have work to finish here." After Mills departed, Katherine and Xavier stood in silence, watching the dust settle in his wake. "He'll be back," Xavier said finally. "I know." Katherine took his hand. "But we'll be ready." The harvest began in earnest the following day. From dawn to dusk, they worked side by side, cutting wheat and binding it into sheaves. The labor was backbreaking, but Katherine found herself drawing energy from Xavier's presence, from the quiet strength he radiated and the occasional touch of his hand against hers. In the evenings, exhausted but satisfied, they would sit on the porch and talk of the future cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Xavier spoke of starting a school in Coyote Creek, of teaching children whose families couldn't afford to send them east for education. Katherine shared her dreams of expanding the farm, perhaps growing fruit trees along the southern slope. Neither mentioned the shadow hanging over them, the sheriff's inevitable return, the charges waiting in Colorado Springs. By unspoken agreement, they lived fully in each day, stealing whatever happiness they could. One evening, as they finished the last of the harvest, Xavier took Katherine's hands in his. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his expression solemn, fear clutched at her heart. "More secrets? No, a truth I've been afraid to speak." He drew a deep breath. "I love you, Katherine Ambrose. I've loved you since that first week when I found you singing to your garden as you weeded in the dawn light." Katherine felt tears spring to her eyes. "You heard that," he smiled. "You have a beautiful voice and an even more beautiful heart." "Xavier, let me finish. I know my situation is precarious. I know I have nothing to offer but myself. But if by some miracle I come through this, I want to build a life with you. Here on this land you fought so hard to keep." Katherine touched his face, tracing the lines at the corners of his eyes. "I love you too, and I don't care what happens in Colorado Springs or anywhere else. You're a good man, Xavier Lawson, the best man I've ever known." Their kiss was a promise, sealed under the vast Montana sky as the first stars appeared above them. 2 days later, Sheriff Mills returned, but he wasn't alone. A well-dressed man rode beside him, along with 2 deputies. Katherine and Xavier were stacking firewood when the group arrived. Xavier straightened, his expression guarded. "Looks like they've made their decision." Katherine's hand found his, squeezing tightly. "Whatever happens, we face it together." The party dismounted, and Sheriff Mills approached with the stranger. "Mrs. Ambrose, Mr. Lawson." "This is Judge Harrington from the Territorial Court." The judge, a stern-faced man with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, nodded in greeting. "I've reviewed the case against Mr. Lawson and spoken with several witnesses from Colorado Springs." Xavier stepped forward. "And what have you decided, Your Honor?" "That's why I'm here in person, Mr. Lawson. This case is unusual." The judge removed his hat. "It seems that after you left Colorado Springs, others began to speak up about Jacob Thornton. First his wife, then several minors whose children had complained of inappropriate behavior." Hope flickered across Xavier's face. "And his daughter, found living with her aunt in Denver, not back east as claimed. She's provided a full statement about years of abuse." Judge Harrington's expression softened slightly. "You were right about him, Mr. Lawson. The charges against you have been dropped." Katherine felt her knees weaken with relief. "He's free to go, free to stay, more accurately." The judge smiled faintly. "In fact, the school board in Colorado Springs sent a letter expressing their regret at losing such a dedicated teacher. It seems you made quite an impression during your time there." Xavier stood stunned, as if unable to process this sudden reversal of fortune. "I don't understand." "How did you find his daughter?" "Credit for that goes to a young reporter for the Denver Post," the judge explained. "She read about the shooting and started asking questions that made the mine owner nervous. When she wouldn't be silenced, the whole story came tumbling out." Sheriff Mills cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, Lawson, I'm glad it turned out this way. Town could use a schoolteacher with principles." After the men departed, Katherine and Xavier stood in the yard, still processing what had happened. "It's over," Katherine whispered, scarcely believing it. "You're free." Xavier turned to her, his eyes bright with emotion. "Not just free, vindicated." He lifted her off her feet in a joyful embrace, spinning her around until she laughed with dizzying delight. When he set her down, his expression grew serious once more. Catherine, what I said before about building a life together, I meant every word. I know you did. Then marry me, not someday, not when things settle down now, this week. Catherine's heart soared at his words, but caution tempered her joy. The town already talks. If we marry so quickly, let them talk, Xavier said fiercely. Let them whisper behind their hands and judge what they don't understand. It doesn't change what we know about each other, about ourselves. His certainty washed away her hesitation. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you, Xavier Lawson. They were wed the following Sunday by the circuit preacher who visited Coyote Creek once a month. The ceremony was small, just the two of them, Sheriff Mills as witness and the preacher's wife, who had kindly brought flowers from her garden to decorate the tiny church. Catherine wore her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the amber flecks in her eyes. Xavier had ridden to the next town to purchase a new shirt and had his worn suit brushed and pressed for the occasion. As they spoke their vows, Catherine felt none of the nervous anticipation that had marked her first wedding. Instead, a profound peace settled over her, a certainty that this union was not the beginning of their story, but the continuation of something that had begun the moment Xavier rode onto her land. The town's reaction was predictably mixed. Some, like old Mr. Hollister, offered cautious congratulations. Others were openly disapproving, particularly the women who had mocked Catherine in the mercantile. But as autumn deepened into winter, and Xavier began teaching children in a corner of the church 3 days a week, attitudes gradually shifted. Parents who had been skeptical found their children returning home excited about learning for the first time. Xavier had a gift for reaching even the most reluctant students, for finding what sparked their interest and building knowledge around it. By Christmas, he had 15 regular pupils and was making plans to construct a proper schoolhouse in the spring. Catherine, meanwhile, found herself embracing her role as a teacher's wife with unexpected enthusiasm. She helped Xavier prepare lessons, hosted study groups in their home, and began a small lending library with books they ordered from back east. Their happiness seemed complete, marred only by the knowledge that the one dream Catherine had cherished since girlhood motherhood remained beyond reach. She tried not to let this shadow touch their joy, but sometimes Xavier would find her looking wistfully at the children in town, her eyes filled with quiet longing. It was on a bitter January evening, with snow piling against the windows and wind howling across the plains, that their lives changed once more. Xavier had stayed late at the church, helping a student who was struggling with reading. Catherine was preparing supper when she heard the unmistakable sound of a wagon approaching, unusual in such weather. She opened the door to find Sheriff Mills climbing down from his wagon, his coat covered in snow. Behind him, huddled under blankets, were 2 small figures. "Mrs. Lawson," the sheriff said grimly. "Sorry to disturb you on such a night, but I've got a situation." Catherine ushered him inside. "What's happened?" Mills helped the 2 blanket-wrapped forms down from the wagon and guided them into the warmth of the house. As they emerged from their coverings, Catherine saw they were children, a boy of about 10 and a younger girl, perhaps 6 or 7. Both had the same dark hair and eyes, their faces pinched with cold and fear. "Found them at the station," Mills explained. "Their mother put them on the train in Billings with a note saying she couldn't care for them anymore. Father died in a mining accident last month." Catherine's heart constricted at the thought. "The poor creatures, do they have family here?" "That's just it. Note mentioned an uncle in Coyote Creek, but there's no one by that name in town." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Ordinarily, I'd take them to Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house, but she's visiting her daughter in Helena." Understanding dawned on Catherine. "You want us to take them in until you find their uncle?" Mills nodded. "Just for a night or 2. Thought with Xavier being a teacher and all." Catherine knelt before the children, who watched her with wary eyes. "Hello there, I'm Katherine Lawson. What are your names?" The boy pulled his sister closer. "I'm Daniel. This is Emma. Are you going to send us to an orphanage?" "No, Daniel. You're going to stay with us until the sheriff finds your uncle." She smiled gently. "Are you hungry? I've made stew." Emma spoke for the first time, her voice small but clear. "Is it hot? We've been cold for so long." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Yes, sweetheart, it's very hot, and after you eat, we'll find you warm beds. When Xavier returned an hour later, he found Catherine sitting by the fire, a sleeping child curled against each side of her. His questioning look turned to understanding as she explained the situation in whispers. Of course they'll stay with us, he said without hesitation. For as long as needed. That night, after settling the children in the spare room, Catherine and Xavier lay in their bed, speaking in hushed tones. What if they don't find the uncle? Catherine asked. What will happen to them? Xavier was quiet for a moment. They'd likely be sent to an orphanage in Helena or Billings. The thought sent a wave of protective fury through Catherine. Those children have lost everything, Xavier. Their father dead, their mother abandoning them, they deserve better than an institution. What are you suggesting? She turned to face him in the darkness. If there's no uncle, perhaps we could keep them. Xavier's hand found hers beneath the blankets. You mean adopt them? Is it so outrageous? You're already their teacher. We have the space and the farm is finally producing enough to support a family. Her voice faltered. Unless you don't want Catherine, he interrupted gently. Nothing would make me happier than raising those children with you. I just didn't want to presume to open old wounds about not having children of your own. She pressed closer to him, drawing strength from his warmth. Maybe this is how we were meant to become parents, not through birth, but through love and choice and circumstance. Days passed with no sign of the mysterious uncle. Daniel and Emma gradually relaxed in their new environment, helping with chores and joining Xavier's lessons. Emma revealed a talent for drawing, while Daniel showed an aptitude for mathematics that delighted Xavier. Catherine found herself falling into the rhythms of motherhood as if she'd been born to it. She brushed Emma's hair each morning, taught her to bake bread, and read stories to both children each night. Daniel, initially more reserved, began to seek her out with questions about the farm and stories about his father. 2 weeks after the children's arrival, Sheriff Mills rode out to the farm with news. No uncle, he confirmed. Wired every town within 100 miles. Seems the mother made him up, hoping the children would be taken in out of Christian charity. What happens now? Xavier asked, though they all knew the answer. Mills sighed. Normally, I'd have to send them to Helena, but he hesitated. I've been watching you with them. They seem happy here. Settled, hope flared in Catherine's chest. Are you saying I'm saying I could delay the paperwork, give you time to file for adoption properly? The sheriff's weathered face softened. Those kids deserve a home, Mrs. Lawson, a real one. That evening, Catherine and Xavier sat the children down and carefully explained the situation. Your uncle hasn't been found, Xavier said gently, and we need to decide what happens next. Emma's lower lip trembled. Are you sending us away? No, sweetheart, Catherine said quickly. Quite the opposite. We were hoping, that is, if you wanted you could stay here permanently with us. Daniel looked between them suspiciously. As what, farmhands? Xavier shook his head. As our children, we'd like to adopt you both legally. You would be Lawsons. Emma's eyes widened. You want to be our mother and father? We do, Catherine confirmed, her heart in her throat. Very much, but only if that's what you want too. Daniel studied them carefully. Our pa is still our pa, even if you adopt us, always, Xavier assured him. We would never try to replace your parents or make you forget them. We would just be additional parents, more people to love you. Emma didn't hesitate. She launched herself into Catherine's arms with a cry of joy. Daniel held back, watching his sister's easy acceptance with a more measured gaze. You don't have to decide right away, Catherine told him, holding Emma close. Take all the time you need. Later that night, Catherine was hanging laundry when Daniel approached, hands thrust deep in his pockets. Madam, can I ask you something? Of course, Daniel, anything. He scuffed the ground with his boot. If you adopt us, what should we call you? Catherine's hands stilled on the sheet she was hanging. Whatever feels right to you, Catherine and Xavier would be fine, or, she swallowed past the lump in her throat. Mother and father, if you ever felt comfortable with that. Daniel nodded, absorbing this. Our first ma, she wasn't always kind. Sometimes she drank the medicine that made her sleep all day and we had to fend for ourselves. I'm sorry, Daniel, that must have been very hard. It was. He looked up at her, his young face serious beyond his years. But you're not like that. You make sure we eat before you do. You mended my shirt without me asking. And you listen when I talk, really listen. Katherine knelt to meet his eyes. That's what parents are supposed to do, Daniel. Love comes in the big moments, yes, but mostly it's in the small, everyday things. Like how you cut the crusts off Emma's bread because she doesn't like them, even though you say it's wasteful, Katherine smiled. Exactly like that. Daniel took a deep breath. I think I'd like to stay, and maybe someday I might call you mother, not right away, but someday. She opened her arms, and after a moment's hesitation, he stepped into them, his small body fitting against hers as if it belonged there. Someday would be perfect, she whispered against his hair. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and new beginnings. The adoption was finalized in March, with Judge Harrington himself coming to Coyote Creek to sign the papers. The schoolhouse Xavier had envisioned was nearly complete, built with volunteer labor from parents grateful for his teaching. The town's attitude toward Katherine had undergone a remarkable transformation. The women who had once whispered about her barrenness now sought her advice on managing strong-willed children. The men who had dismissed her as a widow clinging to a failing farm now respected her as a successful landowner and the teacher's wife. On a warm April evening, Katherine sat on the porch swing, watching Xavier play catch with Daniel while Emma picked flowers in the yard. Her heart felt so full it might burst, filled with a joy she had once thought forever beyond her reach. Xavier caught her watching and smiled, the same smile that still made her pulse quicken after months of marriage. He said something to Daniel and jogged over to join her on the swing. Happy? He asked, slipping an arm around her shoulders. Beyond words, she replied, leaning into his embrace. I never imagined life could be this full. Mother, Emma called, running toward them with a bouquet of wildflowers clutched in her small hand. It was the first time she had used the title, and Katherine's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the offering. Thank you, my darling. They're beautiful. Daniel approached more slowly, still reserved in his affection, but with a growing confidence in his place within their family. Pa says we can ride into town tomorrow to see the new schoolhouse. Pa, Xavier repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel flushed slightly but didn't look away. Is that all right? Xavier cleared his throat. It's more than all right, son. As the children ran off to continue their play, Katherine leaned her head against Xavier's shoulder. Do you ever think about how close we came to missing this, if you hadn't stopped at my farm that day? I believe some things are meant to be, Xavier replied softly. I was running from my past and you were trapped in yours. We needed each other to find a future. They called me childless and worthless, Katherine murmured, and now look at us. Xavier turned to face her, taking her hands in his. I remember something I said to you that first month. Do you recall? She smiled. You said many things that first month, Xavier Lawson. I said you were the strongest person I'd ever met, but there was something else I thought but didn't say. His eyes held hers, filled with a love that still took her breath away. I looked at you and thought, this is the mother I've prayed for the children I might someday be blessed to share with her. Katherine felt tears spill down her cheeks, and now we have them, we do. Xavier brushed away her tears with gentle fingers, and who knows? Perhaps there will be others who need us. This house has room for more love, I think. Katherine looked out at their children playing in the golden light of sunset, at the home they had built together from broken pieces and new beginnings. Yes, she agreed, her heart overflowing. There's always room for more love. And as Xavier's lips met hers in a tender kiss, Katherine knew that the whispers of Coyote Creek had been transformed not into silence, but into a new story. Not of a woman childless and worthless, but of a family forged in courage and compassion, bound together not by blood but by the stronger ties of chosen love.